good at the end. Self. We have all been building up a worldview in our minds since the day we were born, a set of concepts that help us make sense of the world around us. From birth onwards, we've accumulated views and concepts in the mind, mental formations that we use to create a picture of the world. Like a traveler consulting a map, we orient ourselves using these mental references, seeking always to know our position and how we ought to conduct ourselves in it. At the heart of this mental construct lies our deep-seated belief in its reality. And at the very center stands the most cherished illusion, our sense of self. Not content merely with views about the present moment, we construct elaborate stories about how things came to be, and we project our assumptions into what is yet to come. But these views we hold so dear, they are all false, every one of them. They must be false because they spring from the fundamental delusion of self. This delusion acts like a veil, preventing us from seeing things as they truly are. Yet we persist in our habitual way of seeing, clinging to these false views as though they were truth itself. It's the fundamental ignorance we call avijja that constructs this elaborate worldview, filling our memories with beliefs and opinions about everything under the sun. We store up these memories because we are seeking security. Much like when visiting a new place, we look about, noting where everything is, constantly checking and updating our mental map. We're desperately trying to establish a secure sense of permanence in our experience. This endless quest for stability is really quite strange. We use memory to convince ourselves that things remain unchanged, only to become disappointed when circumstances suddenly shift, and everything we'd relied on is turned on its head. But the truth is that change has been occurring ceaselessly all along. It was only our deluded minds that painted an illusion of permanence over life's constant flux. The point is, we persist in this delusion because we crave security. Without that false sense of comfort, we would feel compelled to remain vigilant concerning everything around us, and that heightened feeling of concern would make life very stressful. So we try to fix everything in place, to create a known and therefore safe living environment. We fool ourselves into believing that our world stands still, when, in truth, everything, absolutely everything, is in constant motion. Whether we perceive these changes or not makes no difference. They continue unabated, following the law of impermanence that governs all conditioned things. Seeing through these delusions to understand the true nature of existence is the very heart of Dhamma practice. Only then can genuine peace be found, not in the false security of our mental constructions, but in letting go of all views and allowing things to simply be as they are. When you look at something today and then look at it again tomorrow, naturally you say it's changed. But what's really changed? You have changed. Your mind has changed. In the meantime, you've had new experiences, learned new things. So, when you look again, you're looking with different eyes, different understanding. The thing itself may have changed a bit, but the important change is in the one who's looking. There's a lot of misunderstanding about self and not self. Some people hear not self and jump to the conclusion that there's no self at all, which is nonsense. Of course, there's a self. You're experiencing it right now. But, and this is the crucial point, that self is not permanent. Not for one moment. It's flowing, changing, like the water in a river. Because it's always moving, you can't step into the same river twice, and you can't experience the same self twice either. When people hear the Buddha's teaching on anatta, they often jump to a wrong conclusion. Ah, they say, there is no self at all. But look carefully. We can't deny that something we call self appears in our experience. Each time we say I am, I want, I think, there it is. The very act of referring to it gives it a kind of existence. Consider this. When you're seeing, a seer is present at that moment. When hearing, a hearer is there listening. When thinking, a thinker is actively engaged. But notice how each of these is different. The one who sees is not the same as the one who hears. The one who thinks is not the same as the one who remembers. Each arises anew, depending on conditions. Contrary to what many people believe, the Buddha never actually said, "There is no self." In fact, when someone asked him directly, "Does the self not exist?" he remained silent. When the same person asked, "Is there a self?" again, he wouldn't answer. What he did teach, time and time again, was that nothing we can find in our experiences, not in the physical body, not in feelings, not in memories, not in thoughts, not in perceptions. None of those experiences qualifies as a true self. The Buddha's teaching is quite subtle. He wasn't interested in speculation about whether there is or isn't a self. He was concerned with what causes suffering and what leads to the end of suffering. And he saw clearly that identifying anything as self eventually produces suffering, while letting go of everything leads to contentment. When you probe deeply into what the Lord Buddha taught about self and not self, you find something quite remarkable. He showed that trying to base your practice on any idea of self, whether believing in it or denying it, is like trying to build a house on a sandy foundation. Even if you maintain that your true self is some form of awareness, you're still caught up in a tangle of views that leads nowhere. In all cases, none of these ideas about self will point you the way to freedom from dukkha. The Lord Buddha was very precise about this. He never said there's no self. What he said was that there's nothing unchanging that you can point to and say, "That's my real self." Look at what the Buddha actually taught. All things are anicca. What's anicca is dukkha. What's anicca and dukkha is anatta. In the Buddha's time, people automatically connected the idea of self with permanent happiness. If something wasn't permanently happy, it couldn't be self. That was a common view at that time. So when the Buddha taught anatta, he was directly countering this commonly held belief. Think about it practically. Everything that changes brings dukkha. That's obvious when examined closely. And if everything's always changing, and changes bring dukkha, how can there possibly be permanent happiness anywhere? It's not possible. Because your experience of self keeps shifting. One moment it's in the body, next in feelings, then in thoughts. Your mind is like a monkey in the jungle, swinging endlessly from branch to branch. The real problem isn't that we experience things from a personal perspective. That's natural enough. The problem is, we refuse to see how that personal perspective is forever changing. We latch on to that sense of self as if it were solid and reliable. That's the delusion. As long as we keep denying change, we'll never understand anatta. These two delusions, one about permanence and the other about self, are tied together like two strands of the same rope. Our fundamental delusion of self is deeply ingrained, and therefore critical to the way in which we interact with the world. The Buddha called this delusion manaditi, the notion of I am. I have views, I have ideas, I have thoughts, and so on. In our ordinary interactions with the world, the idea of self is quite necessary because we need a reference point to compare ourselves to other people and to objects in our surroundings. We must have some reference point to function in the world. So, our minds devise a self-perspective. That's all right. It's necessary. But then we cling to a very firm belief in the reality of that self-image, and assume it to be a fixed entity. The delusion really starts when we believe in the permanent reality of that self and react to everything from a self-centered viewpoint. We then harbor opinions of ourselves as being more or less right, or good, or entitled. What are those ideas attached to? They're attached to our views of self, a self which is a virtual imposter. At best, we can say this imposter is the necessary evil of interacting with the world. But there's no essential truth in it, which makes the whole basis of our thinking delusional. Ignorance and craving are the factors that create the delusion of self-identity. They create the delusion that we exist in relationship to something else, meaning a self must exist in relation to what's not self. The defilements convince us that what matters is the advantage to self, and they do whatever they can to promote a strong self-image. Ultimately, the troubles we experience are all caused by believing in that self. When there is self, there is also that which is not self, and there's the relationship between the two. In the relationship, that which is not self defines self, and that which is self defines not self. The two sides work together. Without not self, the self just evaporates. It means nothing. Not self must always be there, always pointing to self, to I am. The belief in an immutable entity is the background to the notion of self, the idea that the self has a fixed, independent existence. The self does exist. Everybody has a self-identity. But that self is an endless series of changing phenomena that whirls about continuously, forever changing appearance like a chameleon. It's not that self doesn't exist, but that it's a bundle of dynamic change. So we cannot pin down the self and say it is this or it is that, because no sooner do we pinpoint it than it immediately becomes different. Because of that, the eternalist's belief in an immutable entity is quite wrong. If something is entirely unchangeable, that must be nibbana. Nibbana is certainly not an entity. Where we have entities, we have comparisons between those entities. When we have comparisons between entities, then those entities must be impermanent in order to exist. The nature of existence can be expressed as a paradox. We can say that the fundamental characteristic of existence is constant change. Existence depends on change. At the same time, anything that changes is not real, because it does not last. The fundamental characteristic of reality is permanence. Thus, the paradox, what exists is not real, and what is real does not exist. Reality and existence cannot therefore be coincident. The world of our sensual experiences is an aspect of existence because nothing remains the same from one moment to the next. Nothing we experience is fixed and immutable. All are flowing and changing. Nibbana is the one permanent reality that does not change. What we call self rather resembles a spinning top. When you watch the top spin, it appears solid and stable. But this appearance comes purely from the continuity of its motion. Stop the spinning, and what remains? Just a bit of wood or metal, nothing more. In this regard, the Lord Buddha gave us a practical teaching to work with, the Four Noble Truths. It's like shining a bright torch into a dark room. You can see exactly where the problem is, dukkha, what's causing it, craving, what it looks like when the problem is solved, nibbana, and the way to solve it, the Noble Eightfold Path. The Lord Buddha was remarkably practical in his teaching. He wasn't interested in abstract philosophical questions about the nature of self. Instead, he wanted us to investigate how we create suffering through our own actions of identifying and clinging, how we are doing this to ourselves, We are the ones who keep picking things up and saying, "This is me, this is mine." This is why the Four Noble Truths are so precious. They show us exactly how we create our own suffering through this habit of identification and clinging. Even when we cling to lofty spiritual ideas, even ideas about permanence or the unconditioned, that very clinging is itself impermanent, as are those very ideas themselves. The clinging comes and goes, the ideas come and go, and we're left still searching, still unsatisfied. It's rather like watching clouds form and dissolve in the sky. Each cloud appears substantial while it lasts. But try to grab hold of one. Your hand passes right through, finding nothing solid at all. Just so with this self. It appears real enough to the untrained eye, but look closely and you'll find only changing conditions. And what drives all this changing? The defilements, greed, hatred, and delusion. They act like the wind that shapes the clouds. But we're so immersed in these defilements that we hardly notice their activities. These defilements create the story of me and mine, moment after moment. They're the reason why we're always trying to prove this self exists, always thinking about who we are, what others think of us. We build up views. I'm this sort of person, or I'm that sort of person. Then we act out these beliefs, often making ourselves quite miserable in the process. It's all rather foolish when you see it clearly. But understanding this principle intellectually isn't enough. We must see it directly through meditation. Only then can we begin to loosen the grip of this persistent illusion. So, this is the way forward. The way of meditation practice. Nothing more, nothing less. We must diligently develop sila, samadhi, and panya. When the wisdom factor ripens naturally through practice, the letting go of self happens by itself, just as a ripe mango falls from a tree without any intervention. Some people worry that letting go of self will leave them with a constant craving, like a smoker who's given up cigarettes but still yearns for them. But that's not correct at all. When something is truly given up through wisdom, there's no residue of wanting left. On the contrary, one day you might suddenly realize, oh, those old patterns of mind simply don't arise anymore. It's rather like finding that an old wound has healed on its own. You don't even think about it. Other people believe that if they could only find the right thing to identify with, something permanent and unchanging, then they would find true happiness. But this notion misses the point entirely. The very act of identifying with anything at all, is itself a cause for suffering. It's like trying to grab hold of a handful of water. The tighter you grasp, the more the water slips away. Many people approach meditation thinking they need to fix themselves or find their true self. They feel something's wrong with them, and they want to make themselves better. But that's going about finding happiness in the wrong way. It's much better to watch the actual suffering that comes from trying to fix yourself. Don't run away from your dukkha or try to cover it up. That just plays into the hands of delusion. But don't wallow in the experience of dukkha either. Remember, the Lord Buddha taught that dukkha can be brought to a complete end. Here's a simple way to understand that principle. If you want to see animals in the jungle, you could waste your time thrashing through the undergrowth looking for them. Or you could do the sensible thing and sit quietly by a water hole, where every animal must eventually come to drink. In the same way, if you want to understand the truth, just sit and watch your suffering and its ending with unwavering attention. Everything you need to know will show itself right there. You'll see how you keep grabbing at things, and you'll see the happiness that comes when you let go. Then you won't need to worry about whether there is a self or isn't a self. You'll have found something far better. the contentment that comes from releasing your grip on everything. The actual methods of meditation that the Buddha taught aren't terribly complicated. What makes them difficult are the obstacles we ourselves put in the way. We are, in truth, our own worst enemies in the practice. The important thing is not so much to do everything perfectly, but rather maintaining the right direction. When we're heading in the right direction, we naturally begin to see our mistakes and correct them. The great barrier, of course, is our attachment to the idea of self. To progress, we must be willing to give up something very precious to us, our cherished sense of separateness. Most people balk at this truth. They're not prepared to accept that, at a deeper level, the distinction between me and others breaks down. When we truly understand this, we can no longer maintain enemies in our hearts. For how can we hate others when fundamentally nothing really separates us? Here's another point that's important to understand. We're not actually trying to destroy the self through meditation. Rather, we come to see that this self we've been protecting so fiercely was never really there to begin with. Otherwise, it's rather like trying to destroy a shadow. How can you destroy something that has no substance? When you shine the light of wisdom on it, the shadow simply vanishes. Nibbana isn't something we have to create or reach for somewhere out there. It must be present within us already. The Lord Buddha was very clear about this. Anything that arises must cease. Therefore, Nibbana, being unceasing, must already be present. It's not something we can manufacture or attain as if it were new and different. This is the heart of the Dhamma, the true Dhamma in our hearts. In fact, we all feel its pull, but it's quite different from the pull of defilements. A child wants sweets right now. That's defilements. But the pull of Dhamma is like a deep longing to return home to that place where everything is exactly as it should be. It's already there. We're just clearing away what obscures it from view. When you really examine it, what we call self is nothing but a bundle of attachments. And the path home, the path to freedom, means letting go of every last one of these attachments. So, how do we accomplish this? We must look very carefully at everything we cling to and examine it in light of the three characteristics: anicca, dukkha, and anatta. These aren't just philosophical concepts. They're simple truths about the nature of everything we experience. Take anicca, impermanence. Everything is constantly changing, flowing, never staying the same. It's like trying to hold onto a handful of water. No matter how tightly you squeeze, it slips through your fingers. And because nothing lasts, because everything we grasp changes, we experience constant dissatisfaction. You can see this in your own experience. You receive something you really want, something that seems wonderful when you get it. But before long it changes or disappears. How can we gain any real happiness from that? And here's the crucial point. If everything is changing, if nothing can give lasting satisfaction, how can any of it be self? This is the nature of anatta. Look closely. Can you find anything that stays the same even for 2 consecutive moments? Where in all this flux could a self possibly exist? The mind contains both delusion and Dhamma. The deluded part creates this sense of me and mine, and always tries to shore up its position, always fighting against the natural flow of things. But fighting against anicca is like fighting against gravity. You'll never win, and you'll only exhaust yourself trying. But there's also Dhamma in the mind, the truth that can guide us home. Dhamma is not separate from us at all, though delusion makes it appear so. It's like discovering you have a wise friend living in your house all along, but you've been too busy looking elsewhere to notice. This truth within will show you the right way, both in your actions and in your meditation practice. The more you trust it, the stronger it grows. So you must learn to recognize and trust the voice of Dhamma within you. It's not something far away or mysterious. It's right here, showing you the way home. But you must be willing to let go of everything you think you are to uncover it.